I have pleasure in opening the council briefing of the 16th of April 2024 at 6 o'clock and welcome all those in attendance. The City of Vincent would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and to pay our respects to the elders past and present. Also acknowledging that as a council, we can play our role towards achieving reconciliation with First Nations people. Now, I've got one apology, and that's from Councillor Hallett. Get well soon, and noticing that Councillor Greer has joined us online, and hopefully recovery is going very well. And I note there are no councillors recorded as having leave of absence. Okay, so I note there are a number of members of the public that are present and want to see, is there anyone who is wishing to speak? Okay, in that case, you can just take your turn. So if you haven't been to a briefing here before, what you do is you just come up to the microphone here, say your name and say and also what suburb you come from, and also what agenda item you want to speak to. We do time to 3 minutes, and you'll be able to see that on the screen right in front of you. The meeting is being live streamed, but if you don't want your comments to be recorded, just tell us. So a summary of your remarks are also going to be included in the minutes, and when your time is up, I will remind you and I'll ask you to then wind up your remarks. So over to you. Hello, you're welcome.
Good evening. Good evening, Mayor Zeman and councillors. My name is Matt Dowell and I'm from 217 Brisbane Street in Perth. I'm here with regard to agenda item 6.4, the Brisbane Street Traffic Concerns petition. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mayor Zeman for meeting with residents on site on the 20th of March to discuss the petition and the survey. There were over 15 residents in attendance, and your visit to better understand our concerns was very much appreciated. In addition, I'd like to thank Manager of Engineering, Luke McGurk, sorry if that's not how you pronounce your surname, Luke, for meeting with me on site on the 27th of March. I'd like to acknowledge Luke's professionalism and transparency with regard to how these assessments are undertaken, along with how and when funding may be allocated based on conflicting priorities and budget constraints. Thank you also to Luke for his efforts in compiling the response to the petition that is being presented tonight. I acknowledge that there are recommendations with regard to implementing short-term, low-cost treatments to address road safety concerns and parking congestion in Brisbane Street. I do reiterate that the current design of the road, in particular the narrowness, will continue to be a safety issue unless the road is widened or traffic volume is reduced and diverted to the main arterial roads such as Bulwer and Newcastle Streets. Should any low-cost options not be sufficient enough to reduce the volume of two-way traffic, I respectfully request that a longer-term plan, which may require more substantial capital works and funding, be explicitly added to the recommendations within the response to petition report and embedded within planning moving forward. I thank you again to councillors along with Luke and your team, and I look forward to working with you all moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, would anyone else like to speak?
Greetings, Mayor and councillors and guests. My colleague in the blue shirt is Ken McCabe, who's the club president of North Perth Bowling Club, long-term resident of North Perth. My name is Paul Russell, club treasurer, and I reside in a neighbouring suburb of Jundana. We appreciate this opportunity to elaborate on our grant application recently lodged with Sport and Rec Department to assist fund the installation of one synthetic bowling green. Please refer to the report 6.1 Community Sport and Rec Facilities Fund application for the bowling club for a bowling green conversion. The club fields pennant teams in 3 divisions on Thursdays and 4 divisions on Saturdays. And again, this year, we have had several of those teams promoted through the divisions. 3 teams played off 4 pennant flags, of which we won 2, making it 4 flags in the last 3 years. With sustained success on the field comes reputation And with that comes growth, meaning more pennant bowlers wanting to join the club. For some time now, our state association, Bowls WA, and many other clubs have been taking notice of the success and the atmosphere that we have created. From a struggling club of less than 300 members in 2019, we have grown both on and off the field. Our focus has been on making the club a strong, family-friendly community recreation hub. We now have many local people, including their children, attending the club on a regular basis, and many corporate functions where they come to enjoy all that the club has to offer, including bowling. The past 4 years have seen memberships of at least 1,000. As I said, 2019, we only had 300 members. More than 800 of the current 1,300 members are local North Perth residents, with another 200 residing in neighbouring suburbs. A synthetic green, while having environmental benefits, is now a necessity for to cater for the sustained increased use that is putting pressure on maintaining the natural grass surface. We envisage more growth in the coming years and look forward to being an integral component of the Woodville Reserve Master Plan and redevelopment to ensure a strong and vibrant recreational hub. The club asks for your financial support to ensure it can continue to provide this community presence and service the recreational needs of members, residents, and guests.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
And I need to fill in this form, I take it.
Okay, who would like to speak next, please? You can take the form and sit down. That's okay. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, good evening. My name is Scott McGill. I'm here representing the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, which is based in Perth. I'm here to speak in relation to agenda item 5.2, the property at 40 Guildford Road in Mount Lawley. So as I think it's well recognised that housing availability and affordability are critical problems for all three levels of government at the moment. Vacancy rates are at record lows, sales prices, build times and build costs are at record highs, and unfortunately most projections show that it's going to get worse before it gets better in Western Australia at least. So in response to this, the state's invested $2.6 billion in a records construction program over 4 years, and that's in addition to significant Commonwealth investment. The Mount Lawley site at Guildford Road is part of the Housing Diversity Pipeline program. Under that program, we have undertaken a lengthy review of government land holdings, seeking to prioritise residential development in infill locations. So the reason we've done this is because those locations will deliver a stronger economic and social benefit to the state developing them for residential development, including social housing. It meets the requirements of the National Partnership Agreement on Housing and Homelessness in relation to well-located sites. It will deliver better precinct community activation, and it'll also allow us to deliver more dwellings for taxpayer dollars by reducing land costs. Most of the land holdings we're talking about were not acquired for the primary purpose of residential development. In the case of the Guildford Road site, they were acquired over time by WAPC and Main Roads WA due to the primary road reserve requirements. So from the state's perspective, the road widening requirements means that the retention of the dwelling at 40 Guildford Road is not possible in any event, and the Main Roads have provided a range of technical reports to this effect, which I won't go into here. So the reason why we're seeking demolition of the property as soon as possible is it will just provide us some certainty around what is the actual developable area of the site to allow us to remediate the site, ready it for construction, and it will also allow us to deliver a better development outcome, including optimising the site, and allow us more options around other outcomes like retaining some of the very large and mature trees on the site. Just in closing, I can also just assure Council that the state's taking great care to select industry partners who will deliver a quality development outcome, who will choose a client group who both need housing near amenities in that area and will integrate well with the community, and will provide a supportive and proactive tenancy management service to the tenants who move in there. So just in closing, I'll thank Council for its consideration of this issue.
Thank you. Would someone else like to speak?
Good evening. My name is Dr. Michael Douglas. I'm representing clients based in Mount Hawthorn, and I'm speaking to agenda item 5.1, which concerns an application for change of land use at 5 Berryman Street. So 62 years ago, when this site last had a commercial component, Australia looked quite different. There were fewer cars and fewer cafes, and local people had fewer options to get the things they needed. These days, locals already have an abundance of coffee options. There's a cafe strip less than a 10-minute walk away from the proposed site, Scarborough Beach Road, with 6 comparable coffee options. For residents with a taste for coffee, this proposed cafe would be more of the same. It's a matter of minor convenience to them. But for the residents who I represent immediately surrounding this site, this application would lead to a source of major inconvenience. It will affect their sleep, their street, their kids' safety, and the value of their homes. The applicant has sought to emphasise that the majority of the community support the application. I question whether that's right, but assuming that it is, majority rules, of course, is not the way to run a city. If the majority of the city wanted a noisy cafe next to your house, would you be okay with that? Some of you no doubt would, and others might not. But our client, one of them in particular, bought a property and spent substantial sums of money on renovations based on the reasonable assumption that it was a residential neighbourhood surrounded by residential properties. The assumption was reasonable because 5 Berryman Street has been a residential house for the last 62 years. There's plenty to criticise in this application, even though the applicant has had multiple goes at the task. But for one thing, there's no compliant toilet on the site. Approval of the council would require the council to ignore the building code. For another thing, there is noise. The applicant has produced an unverified acoustic letter. It supports the common sense idea that the cafe in a house will produce noise. Compliance with regulations, though, would ultimately fall on the goodwill of the operator and of the 14 patrons or more of the cafe crammed into a very small space waiting for their coffee. We don't know at this stage who the operator is because, as I understand it, the applicant has indicated that they will be leasing out this cafe as a business. Please do not exercise your powers to enable a profit-making property development activity to make a windfall at the expense of the ratepayers immediately neighbouring the property. Thank you.
Okay, do we have another speaker?
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. My name is Nathan Ebbs and I'm speaking to item 5.1, and I apologise in advance because the primary focus of my submission will be toilets. It was just mentioned to the council just then that it's made clear that under this proposal that the existing single house will remain as it is and would continue to be used for that purpose. The cafe would be utilised by a lessee operator and not the person occupying the house. But what you're confronted with when you look at the current proposal is actually a proposal that's incapable of acceptance in its current form, and this is critical. If the operation of the cafe cannot be restricted to the area described and spills into the residents surrounding, it will no longer be a residential dwelling, and a small cafe combination has been set out to be will render the residential property incapable of exclusive habitation. In this regard, the toilet issue we've referred to that's been outlined is critical to this consideration, and this development application is manifestly deficient without this issue being dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with before the proposal can proceed. I'll explain why. Under the relevant building code, this property requires toilet facilities for patrons. It doesn't have them currently. The application is entirely silent on this issue, and the only toilet available for use on these premises is the one in the private residence occupied, we're told, by a tenant who has nothing to do with this cafe. The only possible workaround available to this proposal is that customers of the cafe will use the private residence toilet, which is simply not permitted. According to the plans, they will need to access the existing toilet through the kitchen of the house. Now, there's plans that are provided, and if you look at them, you'll see that's the only method of access or thoroughfare through the property. The applicant needs in this proposal to provide some clarity about what's proposed, as it's currently got a non-compliant DA with the applicable building code, and it must be. Until that's dealt with, this application simply cannot be determined by this council. Further concerns with this development application are the onus it puts on this city police requirements with respect to patron numbers, people not milling about on the street outside, and the associated noise issues which are supposed to be dealt with by ensuring a door to a cafe is kept closed, which is, in my submission, completely unworkable. Ultimately, it should not be forgotten that Mount Hawthorn is a suburb that's been evolving, and substantial investment decisions are made by residents to move into a family-friendly area near a park, away from commercial enterprise, which is located on Scarborough Beach Road and Anzac Roads. This is not a situation where the local community is crying out for another coffee shop. There are multiple coffee shops accessible to everybody a short distance away. My final point is that this council well knows that planning approval attaches to the land in REM, and once approved, another cafe could operate from the premises without any further intervention of this council and the City of Vincent. And in this regard, look at the issues that are faced by the town of Cottesloe relating to the North Street Bakery and its impact on local amenity as it became busier and busier. A busy cafe on Berryman Street is at odds with the expectations of the residents and the residential amenity in Mount Hawthorn. And for that reason, this application should be refused. Thank you.
Okay, do we have a further speaker?
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. My name is Daniela Merger from Urbanista Town Planning, and tonight I'm here on behalf of the landowner and as the applicant speaking in favour of the officer's recommendation to approve the proposed cafe at number 5 Berryman Street, Mount Hawthorn. It's item 5.1. As I'm sure you're all aware, the subject site contains an existing single dwelling which is proposed to be retained with an original attached corner store development. I've been made aware through a local resident that in the 50s, this corner store was a milk bar and delicatessen which served the local Mount Hawthorn community. When our clients first approached us back in July last year with their intentions to revive the space into a cafe, my first thoughts were, based on also my experience within the city, that this is exactly what the City of Vincent wants. This is an ideal location for this development in its proposed function and its scale. The proposed cafe is extremely small. It has a floor area of just over 30 square metres and a maximum of 14 patrons. The cafe is not intended to attract users from outside the local neighbourhood or area. Rather, the intention is to operate in conjunction with the existing users of Menzies Park and to serve the local residents. Whilst originally we were excited with the prospect of this application, the process that we've been on to get to this point has been stressful and onerous on our client. Notwithstanding, we're here today with a recommendation for approval, which we would like to thank the administration for. However, we do have some minor requests for amendments and removal of conditions, which I would like to run through. Firstly, we request that condition 2.3 be amended to state that the restriction of the staff be limited to external staff only. Our understanding is that the staff limit is primarily driven by the number of car bays provided on site, which we have provided 2 staff car bays. Whilst not confirmed at this stage, there is a good chance that residents of the dwelling may operate or work at the cafe. As residents would not generate additional car parking to the site, because they already live there, it makes sense that they should not contribute to the staff limit. Secondly, we respectfully request that condition 2.4 specifically confirms that the maximum number of patrons relate to the premises only. This will enable the possibility for an application for an alfresco dining permit to be submitted at some stage if they wish, noting that this is under different legislation and should not be controlled under the planning approval. Thirdly, we also seek Council to consider the removal of conditions 3.2 and 3.3. These conditions are considered to be extremely onerous and almost impossible for the operator and the city to be able to police and govern, and they're just not necessary for a business of this minimal scale and intensity. We find it inappropriate for the operator to provide a plan on where people will stand while waiting for coffee, and then to dictate to patrons.
Need to wrap up your comments, please.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you.
sorry, won't be a moment. Where they should be standing while waiting. In my past experience, just to touch on the comments relating to the toilets, whilst I'm not a building surveyor, it's my understanding that toilets are only required under the BCA where there are 20 or more patrons. So I don't think toilets are required in this case. However, I'll leave that to the manager potentially to confirm.
You might need to leave it there. Thank you. But you're welcome to come back next week if you want and,
Okay, I
and
just
give a further.
wanted to wrap it up that, look, there has been over 100 submissions of support, and we hope that council consider our amendments and modifications to the recommendations next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so does anyone else wish to speak? Okay. All right. Okay, so the items that have been spoken on are going to be brought forward on the agenda, and questions will be asked about those first. So you don't have to stay around for the whole meeting unless you want to. And a reminder that it's not going to be any decisions that are going to be made at this briefing. This is an opportunity for councillors to ask questions of the administration on the items that are on the agenda. The decisions are going to be made next week, and of course you're welcome to come along to that meeting as well. So there being no further questions, I close a public question time at 6:21. Okay, so Governance Manager, you've got some questions and statements in writing.
We have. I'm not going to read out every single name, but just to say that we did receive 21 submissions in support of item 5.1 from residents of Mount Hawthorn. Anyone who did raise questions in relation to that item will have a response in the briefing notes, and those submissions will all be captured in the minutes. Also to note that we received a written statement from Scott McGill from the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage in relation to item 5.2.
Okay, CEO, you do have a list of the declarations of interest.
Thank you, Mayor Zaman. 3 declarations of interest received tonight, all in relation to item 6.1, which is the funding application for North Perth Bowling and Recreation Club synthetic bowling green conversion. The first from Councillor Warner. It's a financial interest, noting that Councillor Warner's son is employed at the club. Second is an impartiality interest from Councillor Wolf, noting that the councillor has had a long-standing relationship with the club, and Councillor LaFontaine declared an impartiality interest, noting that Councillor LaFontaine is a social member of the club. That's all the, and one more from Councillor Castle.
Apologies, CEO. Also like to declare an impartiality interest on that item. I'm also a social member of the club. And in addition, can I declare an impartiality interest on 5.3 as I'm acquainted with a number of the applicants for the design review panel.
Are there any other conflicts of interest that councillors wish to declare? Okay, so now I'm just going to go round. Councillor Warner, what items would you like to discuss, please?
I think all the ones I was interested in have been raised already, so
okay.
thank you.
Councillor Wallace?
Same for me, thank you.
Councillor LaFontaine?
Same.
Councillor Castle? Councillor Greer?
Nothing further from me, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Alexander? 5.5. Okay. And sorry, and okay. So for myself, Councillor Wolf.
Just 8.1 from me, thank you.
Okay. Okay, and I'm just going to double check all the ones that are already. I wanted to ask something about 5.4 as well. Okay, all right. We're just going to organise the order. Okay, so we will start with item 6.4, Brisbane Street response to petition. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just wondering through the director, what is actually being proposed here? What low-cost treatment is the city proposing to deliver?
Through the chair, more than comfortable for the manager to address, but I believe it's signs and lines initially.
Okay, and so I'm just trying to understand the process of, because normally we are approving a particular plan to go for consultation. So will council see that design before it goes to consultation, or this decision would allow you to go away and design something that goes straight out to consultation?
Through the chair, the request is for administration to design up some low-cost treatments within the Brisbane Street area. That will also go for consultation with the community and then be delivered on site.
Okay, so it won't come back to council before it goes for consultation.
Through the chair, not if once consultations concluded with the community, the plan would be to implement the low-cost treatment.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, last week we had some really interesting information about the traffic warrant scoring, and it's a request for the report for next week. Could we have an indication of the scale of that, like where 30 sits within the scale and what the range is and what other scores might indicate?
Through the chair, yes, the scoring for Brisbane Street was confirmed at 30. 30 is the minimum threshold, so that's the minimum score to intervene in any sort of treatment.
Okay, so that would be really useful in the report next week. And if I understand correctly, if that score had been less than 30, the recommendation would be no action?
Through the chair, yes, if it's below 30, we would generally monitor it for the next 12 months.
Thank you.
Councillor Fontaine, did you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think you asked all the questions I had in mind, but I was just wanting to ask about the particular request on the petition, how it mentions about it was consideration be given to redirecting westbound traffic on Brisbane Street up Lake Street to the main arteries of Bulwer and Newcastle Streets. Would the low-cost traffic treatment being proposed address that concern?
Through the chair, administration need to go through the detailed design, but traffic flow could be a part of that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Warner.
Just following up on what Matt had to say, he asked if the short term, if this was to proceed and the short term solution wasn't really successful, was there any provision to put in some sort of long term mitigation plan? I was wondering if you had any comments on that.
Chair, yes, that is an option. Just given priorities, because it doesn't score that highly, we would put this on the list to look at. And I think the report talks about longer term solutions, the design being completed within an 18-month period or longer.
I had some questions about the parking situation. I noted in the report there was a very high percentage of non-residents that were parking in the area. Is there any indication of the average time that people are parking there? I'm just trying to get an idea of whether they're there for the pub or for, say, a sister, or whether they're actually doing all day parking. Wonder if you can give me some sort of indication as to who that are not residents are parking there.
Through the chair, I know the report talks about 78% parking capacity in that area, but the manager of Rangers is online and might be able to elaborate a little bit more.
Manager, would you like to respond to that?
Through the chair, I haven't looked at the data at that level, but can look at it tomorrow and include in the briefing notes.
Thank you. That would be good. I suppose I'm conscious of wanting to make sure that we don't make things too difficult for those local businesses at the same time as if people are parking there for extended periods of time, then yeah, they can not unless they live there, I suppose. So it'd be good to get some indication around that. Thank you. Are there any other questions, Councillor Wallace?
Thanks, Mayor Simon. I guess in my observations around road treatments is that it's very difficult to build consensus around any one specific treatment. Just wondering, therefore, about the wisdom of going out with just one option to the community to consult on. Would you see any benefit in presenting a range of different outcomes and polling people's opinion against all of those rather than picking one and running with it?
Through the chair, the traffic warrant did suggest that speeds are slightly over the 40 km mark, so the focus would be slowing traffic with the short-term interventions through signage and line marking to do that.
So you see no benefit in consulting on a number of different treatment options?
Through the chair, we will consult on a number of options, but we are limited with the low cost options. Some of them options might be longer term options that the team can take on board again within 18 months or longer to come up with that design.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions on this item? Okay, well, in that case, we'll move on to our next item, which will be, okay, item 6.1. Councillor Warner, you've declared a financial interest. So, yeah, if you could leave, please. Thank you. Okay, and we've had a few people declare their impartiality interests already. Any questions in relation to this matter? Councillor Wolf.
Thank you, Mayor. I was hoping to just seek two updates on two related matters. Part of the briefing notes would be fine. The first one is there was a request that came through that I saw in my inbox from the club in February around essential maintenance to the driveway at the club. I think seeking an update about where that's at will be important because looking at the report, the benefits are highlighted of the synthetic turf in terms of attracting more people to the club, in terms of disability access. So if it's the case that we've got a safety issue right at the entrance of the club, I think that's something that needs to be considered. The second related matter I was hoping to get an update on was what Mr. Russell referred to in the public gallery, which was around the Woodville Reserve Master Plan. I think an update around where that's at will be quite useful for understanding this proposal in that broader context of the precinct, which has a lot of promise.
Hey, Manager.
Thank you, through the chair. In the first case, in respect to the driveway, we did have a look at the driveway, considered its condition. We didn't feel it needed immediate treatment, but we have scheduled work to be done on it, I think, into the new financial year. In respect to the Woodville Reserve Master Plan, certainly we can provide an update of where that is. I can simply say from a perspective, given that there is only one lawn bowls club within the city, it would be expected that that would be remaining where it is, and therefore looking at logistics of moving infrastructure around, moving greens in a master plan probably isn't necessarily an outcome. So the return on investment for it and the timelines, I think it is fine for that sort of investment to be put into that particular location.
Councillor Wolf.
Thank you. And just one follow-up question around the finances for that one. I think the report had indicated that an outcome might be made available mid-year. And if it was approved, that funds would need to be used by the following year, mid-year. Is there any sort of indication around if this was approved when those funds would be made available? I'm just cognizant that the club does have a sort of pretty full bowling and event calendar, so having an understanding to plan around that would be useful.
Through the chair, we can certainly put our understanding what the timeframes will be in respect to funding. My understanding is that the club's going to project manage the delivery themselves, and so they'll be able to, based on the funding, manage that project around that space. So we can confirm in the briefing notes.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a question about the environmental impact of the synthetic green. The report includes a assessment of the impact in comparison to a grass green, and I'm just wondering if any consideration has been given to the environmental impact of synthetic lawn in general, because I understand there's obviously some impact in terms of surface runoff, flooding and the soil beneath. And I'm just wondering, very happy for that to be in the briefing notes, if we could have some of that information included.
Happy to have something in the briefing note. I suspect there hasn't been any study done site-specific in respect to the impact of artificial turf on that location, but there's been certainly plenty of research around artificial greens generally, and I will check if we've got some of that to hand included in the briefing notes, and try to extrapolate from that whether there are concerns in respect to the current proposed site.
Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Councillor Alexander.
Yeah, just a couple. In applications like these, you know, we hear that we're not going to need a greenkeeper and savings on water and all those sorts of things. Also, we don't want to see the same club back here in 10 years' time wanting to replace the synthetic surface. So generally it's suggested that there be a sinking fund for this to ensure, and I've spoken with the CEO about this, I would have thought it was normal practice to ensure that we're not back here in 10 years' time, you know, looking for CSRFF funding to do the same replacement.
Thanks, Mayor Zaman. I need to mention that we can discuss with the club what their plans would be to ensure adequate reserves are put in place over the course of the life of this new facility, if approved, to ensure replacement and maintenance costs are catered for.
We can discuss it with the club, or we can say, you know, we don't want to see you back here for the same item. And if you are making savings on greenkeepers and other things, then it's reasonable to have a sinking fund so that the ratepayers of Vincent don't have to pay for it again.
Okay, so we take that as comment. Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So the next item is 5.2, amendment to the Municipal Heritage Inventory, number 40, Guildford Road, Mount Lawley. Okay. All right, are there any questions pertaining to this matter? Councillor Wallace.
Thanks, Ms. Amon. I did read the traffic assessment report. I guess the question I was trying to ask, well, the report kind of compares two options, a single turning lane versus a dual turning lane. I think the most important question here is the length of that dual turning lane. Like, there's no dispute the two lanes can go in further closer to the intersection. I guess the question, I'm not sure if admin can help with this, or we need to go back to main roads, is what is the impact of shortening that dual turning lane by the 20-metre frontage of this building? I don't think that can be answered by the traffic assessment report that was provided, but I think that was the intent of the deferral. I think there was a question in there.
Through the chair, we can confirm that in the briefing notes.
Thank you. There was a comment from Mr. McGill during his presentation around how removal of this house would assist with the retention of mature trees. I guess I note there's two trees within this area that's proposed to be, two very mature trees that are proposed to be removed as part of this road widening. Does admin have a view on whether retention or removal of this house would add or remove to tree retention on the site?
Through the chair, I guess the removal wouldn't necessarily impact either way. I think in terms of the key thing in considering the ability to retain the trees would be what the ultimate design and development outcome intended for the site is. So the subject site is on the, I guess, western edge of the 34 lots. So that may present an opportunity to retain some trees, but that's not a question we'd be able to answer through this process.
And I think it's answered in the report as well, but has the department provided any information whatsoever about their intent on how they want to develop this site? I guess the program is called a housing diversity pipeline, and potentially retention of this heritage item might form part of the diversity of the housing on that site.
Through the chair, no information has been provided as to what could ultimately be constructed on the site.
And can you please request that from DPLH prior to the meeting next week?
Are there any other questions in relation to this item? Councillor Castle.
Thank you. I had a lot of the same questions as Councillor Wallace because we did defer this item in October for specific questions, which maybe haven't been answered. I have a question in relation to the development application. And I think it relates to Councillor Wallace's question. There is talk of a DA in the report and that it is on hold, does that propose a development on that property, or is it for removal? I'm just not quite clear what that is for.
Through the chair, yes. So the DA that is referred to in report is in relation to the demolition of the existing building, and that's required because of the heritage status.
Okay. And in relation to that DA that is now on hold, when does the clock start again?
Through the chair, so the city has agreed with, or administration has agreed with the applicant of that DA for that to be put on hold until, I guess, this request to remove the property from the MHI has been resolved. So I guess as we haven't confirmed a start, a recommencement of the clock, but I would suspect that would commence if council didn't support the removal.
Or effectively when we make a decision one way or the other next week. Yeah. Okay. I would have had a lot more questions, but there's such an excellent risk topic in this report, so thank you for that. Really appreciate it. That's all for me. Thanks.
Hey, are there any other questions in relation to this item? Because I just had one question, and that's about the recourse. So as I read it, if the council were to vote not to have this removed from the list, that this would actually be able to be appellable within the SAT, as I understand it, and I just want to get that confirmed.
Yes, to you, Ms. Amon. So the decision itself in relation to the removal from the MHI isn't reviewable by the SAT, but the development application that is currently on hold would be. So if council wasn't supportive of the request to remove the property from the MHI, the applicant could pursue the current DA, either requesting council to make a decision on that, which they could seek review of through SAT, or alternatively they could, depending on the status of the stopping the clock and how many days they'd have to wait, they could pursue a deemed refusal through SAT as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Warner.
So if I'm reading that right, basically if we don't support this removal, the result is it will either be appealed or it will be left to continue to fall apart. So if you're the house, basically there's not much joy in this for you either way.
I guess in terms of the options, there are options available for the owner to seek review of a decision or a non-decision. But yeah, I'm not sure what the question actually was in that.
We'll take that as a little bit of a question and quite a bit of a comment. So that's okay. All right. Are there any other questions in relation to this item? All right. I'm going to move on to the next one, which is Lot 5, Berryman Street, Mount Hawthorn, change of use from single house to single house and restaurant cafe. Okay. Are there any questions? Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Firstly, I have a question about the toilet that was discussed at length in the chamber tonight. Can administration give some indication on what requirements are for provision of a toilet with this application?
Through you, Mayor Simon, sure. So toilets are required under a separate legislation, which is the Building Act, and there's a separate process and that head of power where we would consider the amount of toilets needed and whether they need to be provided. So it's not a planning requirement. There's no departures around toilets in considering this application, and it's not a relevant consideration when determining this application. If they do get to that next step of obtaining their building permit and their occupancy permit, there's a number of ways that they can address the toilet requirements. So that could be through providing toilets on site, or there's another option through a performance solution, which they can obtain at occupancy permit stage through and it would essentially be up to their private certifier to demonstrate that. So we can get some further information from our building team and include it in the briefing notes regarding the requirement for toilets, and we can discuss with the applicant if toilets are required, how they would intend to address that through the separate process at the building stage.
Thank you. And if you could particularly consider whether the location of public toilets in Menzies Park would be relevant to that. Thank you. The second question is around staff numbers. It was suggested in the chamber that there could be a variation to the condition that specified that was only external staff. What does administration have a view on that?
3 minutes, Simon. Yes, sure. So the condition 2.3 doesn't intend on restricting staff who also live at the house. Based on the proposal before us, we're of the understanding that all staff would be external, and that's how we've conducted our assessment. Based on the applicant also seeking for the potential for staff who reside at the house to also work at the premises, a key consideration for that would be sufficient parking, which could be accommodated within the designated residential bay already on site. But we can consider this further and include some information in the briefing notes, discuss with the applicant and update the recommendation.
Thank you. There was also a query around the number of patrons that is currently, I think the wording is currently inside only, and how that might intersect with a future application for al fresco.
Through you, Mesamon. Yes, so essentially condition 2.4, which restricts the amount of patrons to 14, is also linked to condition 3.2, which is around restricting the ability for patrons to dine, wait, or queue outside. Specifically talking to condition 2.4, the reason for conditioning the 14 people is primarily tied to the amount of the requirements under the city's parking policy. So by uncapping that, it would be open to council, but a key consideration would be a shortfall in parking that would result from that. So that would need to be something that would need to be considered in amending that condition. In regards to the removal of condition 3.2, which would be essentially permitting queuing, waiting and dining to occur outside the premises, there would be a range of considerations when deciding the appropriateness of this. So a key consideration for the assessment which is the acceptability of the land use in this location, is whether the land use is compatible and complementary to the residential area. Ultimately, in considering our assessment, generally managing patron noise can be very difficult because it is behaviour dependent. So, and it's very difficult to attenuate that noise, particularly in a public area. So that is essentially why we've landed on completely restricting that from our assessment. But it would be open for council to consider removing that condition, and there would be alternate ways. We could look at including a requirement for an acoustic report to address or consider noise emissions from alfresco dining at a certain scale as part of a condition.
Thank you. I suppose I'm interested in this particular condition and would be interested in some more information about how that might be managed elsewhere in the city. The example that springs to mind is Chew Bakery, which has a lot of queuing outside and is close to residential properties. I think they have a velvet rope or something to manage that, and just whether that was considered, or if there might be options that could be considered in this case. Also, the inclusion of the word dine in that condition, I would appreciate some information about whether that then precludes an application for alfresco or how that impacts that application.
Through Mesamon, yes. So essentially the applicant would be required to comply with the conditions of this development approval. So it would still be open for them to obtain an outdoor eating permit. However, there's a term of that permit that they must also comply with the terms of other approvals, including their planning approval. So effectively, this condition would restrict all alfresco dining, irrespective of whether they obtain an outdoor eating permit.
Okay, so it would basically stop that application before it even started. I suppose I will foreshadow I might bring an amendment on that matter next week. Can I ask, just going back to the patron numbers, when a application is considered for alfresco dining, does that add to the number of patrons that are allowed on site, or does it still have to fit within the approved number?
Through Mesamon, yes, it needs to fit within the approved number as conditioned.
Thank you. Sorry, I have a couple more. A question about the hours. So the original application, I believe, had 7 to 7, and what is being proposed now is 7 till 4. Can you just give some background on how that change came about and whether the applicant is happy with those hours?
Through Mesamon, yes. So the applicant initially proposed operating hours from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. Throughout the assessment and in response to comments raised during community consultation, touching on the comments from community consultation, there was concerns raised regarding the hours of operation and the intensity of the use across a large span of the day. As part of our assessment, we also considered the intensity of the proposal in considering the compatibility with the area. And ultimately, we had that discussion with the applicant regarding the scale and intensity of the use. Operating hours is one way to effectively reduce the intensity of the use, as is size or other operational measures. In response to those discussions, the applicant did choose to amend the operating hours to 4 p.m. closure. That's where we ended up.
Thank you. And in relation to the public holiday hours being closed, that's quite unusual. We normally see them as being the same hours as Sunday. Is there a particular reason for that?
Through you, Ms. Amon, it wasn't contemplated through the proposal. So effectively, the condition of approval that we've included would permit operation on public holidays. It would be subject to the findings in the acoustic report. So condition 2.4 would allow that subject to the acoustic report findings.
Thank you. And final one, I promise. Just in relation to the consultation and the submissions that were received over the 3 separate consultations, are we able to get an understanding of whether these are repeat submissions, firstly, across the subsequent consultations, and also the submissions of immediate neighbours versus the wider community, if that's possible to gather that?
Ms. Amon, sure, we can provide some additional detail in the briefing notes.
Okay, are there any other questions in relation to this item? Councillor Wolf.
Thank you, Mayor. My understanding is that this application was originally received by the City on the 16th of August. And we've, as councillors, had a lot of queries from the community around the delays in this process. So I thought to start off, it might just be valuable to hear from administration the reasons for those delays, particularly in the context of some of the issues that have been raised around the fact that within this process, concerns raised by the City might have led to further concerns by the City. For example, capacity increases leading to concerns around parking, subsequently leading to concerns around noise and landscaping. Thanks.
Through Ms. Amon, we definitely acknowledge the delays in the application. It's probably a combination of a range of different matters. Definitely some delays on our end in terms of processing timeframes and timely assessment, which was at the beginning of the application. In terms of the delays regarding considering the acceptability of the use, we were working with the applicant to really get to a point of support, and that included really to the point we're at now, and that included taking on community submissions and trialling a few changes to the proposal to get it to a point that addressed all of the different elements to make it compatible in its current area. So that's kind of resulted in a couple of requests for further information, consulting with the community again, because some of those changes did introduce changes that would impact neighbouring properties, such as introducing additional parking next to adjacent properties, or the operation of the use, such as increasing patron numbers and the like, which under our consultation policy did require re-advertising. So that also did add to the delays of the proposal process.
Thank you. And just one more on process. We received some correspondence advising that the applicant was only notified around the initial consultation round of the 3. So I was hoping administration might be able to confirm whether that's the case and whether or not that's usual practice. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, we can take that on notice.
Thank you, appreciate that. I then just wanted to move to condition 3.2 around customers not queuing or waiting for takeaways on the footpath or the verge. In terms of things like noise mitigation, I'm just wondering if there's a view from administration around how effective that would be given the context that we're across the road from an active sporting park.
Through you, Chair, in terms of noise mitigation, ultimately proximity and its setting is really important. I guess the starting point is taking a few steps back is what's before you is primarily a consideration around appropriateness of the land use. In terms of the physical works, there's an existing building there. It's going to be modified and refurbished to accommodate this non-residential land use, but primarily the planning consideration is around the land use. Now, in terms of land use, the starting point is under the city's planning scheme, you've got different permissibilities. This particular land use is an A use, which means that it's not permitted unless council exercises discretion after you've gone through a process of new consultation and considering all of the relevant planning matters. So that's the starting point. It's about fitting in to that area. It's a residential area. It's intended to remain as a residential area. It's surrounded by two-storey single houses on all frontages, but it does sit across from a park, which you correctly pointed out has noise and activity associated with that. So it's about balancing all of these considerations. That noise generated from the park has a certain profile and it occurs at specific times of the day and it's a certain proximity away. This would be introducing a different noise profile associated with people coming and going to the premises, as well as potentially people congregating on the adjacent footpath and nearby areas, and that introduces a different level of noise or potential noise impacts to the area. So I suppose from the administration's perspective, we've considered how can we construct this, the terms or the conditions of the approval so that it's measurable in terms of how can we minimise the potential impact of people, you know, dining or queuing or whatever it is associated with the activity. And that's why we've come up with that condition to say contain all of those, all of that queuing and such within the premises, because that is measurable. That would be valid in terms of ensuring compliance when we monitor the terms of the approval. In terms of noise mitigation, if that was to be allowed for and people able to congregate outside, you would need to be my advice is that you would need to be accepting that that comes with noise and activity, and you just need to balance that and say, is that appropriate in this particular location? Does that make sense?
Thank you. I appreciate that detailed response. The last question I had, you did touch on it somewhat now, was around the enforceability of some of these conditions, particularly 3.2 and 3.3. So I think it would be quite helpful if you could just walk us through how that works in practice in terms of enforceability by the applicant and then from the city's perspective as well.
Through you, Mayor Zaman, the way condition 3.2 has been structured is for enforceability. And that's in considering everything that Joe's just spoken to and in considering the ability to manage takeaway orders and reduce off-site amenity impacts from customers potentially queuing down the street, congregating, dining on verges and things like that. It is an effective way to very clearly manage those impacts, whether people are inside the building or outside the building. Condition 3.3 is more around updating the operational management plan so that customers are aware about where they can and can't wait and ensuring that there is appropriate waiting space inside the building. The alternate to these conditions would be conditions around looking to manage queuing down the street or dining maximums outside or the like, which on balance we have considered to be difficult to enforce, particularly it is very, like I said before, based on patron behaviour, as well as the amount of people attending the premises that could result in queuing past the lot boundary or those off-site amenity impacts generated from noise, coming and goings and the like. So from our perspective, the conditions 3.2 and 3.3 are enforceable from the city's perspective.
Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to go to the actual recommendation itself, where this land has been for a single house for many, many years. What determines someone to come along and can this happen anywhere? I heard Jay talk about, you know, there's specific land, and you know, I'm interested to hear what's so special about the 34 metres. But I'm sure there's residents who are bought adjacent to this house who've done their due diligence and see it's for single use and all the rest of it. And then along comes someone assisted by the City of Vincent who then seeks approval to change it. So I would like to know exactly how that happens. And, you know, I'm concerned that we then sit and agree with some of that. And where else could it happen? And also in 2.2, it talks about no further development until approval is received by the city. But that's almost indicating the bottom of 2.2, the last two lines, that there is something else planned for this site, which would perhaps be approved by the City of Vincent. So, you know, how can anyone be sure of buying a piece of land when its zoning is single use only, and then someone applies for change of use? So could we actually have some feel how that happens, and how likely is it to happen somewhere else? Because it doesn't at first glance seem fair. And everyone's talking about all the fine detail, you know, and, you know, the chances of all that being enforced, in my view, is Buckley's and none. And so once it's there, it's there. The noise will be there. You know, someone will say, let's measure it, and then it's not enough, and it'll never happen. So you're stuck with, you know, 14 people making a racket, where previously you bought a house in good faith on a single use block only.
Manager, did you want to make a comment?
Through you, Chair. It's a really good question around certainty and surety, in a residential area. Ultimately, we set aside land that would allow for different types of purposes. Okay, so this area is residential zone, but the objectives of a residential zone, one of those is to actually accommodate a range of non-residential uses that's compatible and complementary to that area. Another one is to enhance the amenity and character of that residential area, and it needs to be compatible with that existing area.
Excuse me for I butt in, Jay, but a developer who I do know, that if you get a good barrister and a good town planner, you can change anything. And so, you know, we've got go to this section, go to that section, go to this, and by the time you look at it, you need a good lie down. And I suppose you can only do and meet what the application is. So some resident decides wants to have a coffee shop, where some other resident has bought it in good faith as a single house. So,
Through you, Chair. Sorry, I'll continue. I was going to go on to say that ultimately that's what the area can consider, a range of non-residential land uses. And when you actually have to work, you do need to work through all of those rules and all of those requirements and the detail that you referred to, because that's ultimately what we're doing here. Quasi-judicial decision making, we're bound by the planning legislation, and it is a lot to unpack, and we've tried to step that through in the report. But fundamentally, in terms of surety, there can be no assurance in a residential area. Somebody is allowed to pursue or seek to get a change of use to introduce a non-residential land use. But this is why this discussion is important in terms of decision making, to lay out all the facts to say, based on what they're proposing to do and the scale and intensity, you've heard some of those terms used tonight, is it appropriate in this particular location, adjoining existing single residential developments, but also across from a park? Is that a reasonable thing to consider? And I suppose this is what we've tried to set out for you in the council report. And then I suppose from a decision-making process, that's what you are bound to consider in terms of making this planning decision. So in terms of surety, no, residential zone does not say you cannot contemplate any change of uses. It actually allows for it, but you need to balance all of these competing considerations to make sure it's complementary to the area.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Alexander?
well, there's about 15 or 16 things they have to meet. And the city is guaranteeing that they're going to ensure the enforcement of those. They're like 14 people only, and then along come another 2. Where are they going to wait? Across in the park? I don't think so.
Okay, so we'll take that as a comment. Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Mayor Zeman. I just had a few questions about the suitability of this noise letter. I guess I've read through it. It pretty accurately sets out assigned noise levels for the receptors, but I find that there's generally a lack of substance in the sections following there. There's no estimation of the amount of noise that will be generated. There's been no assessment of noise treatments within the cafe at all. It just says there'll be 14 patrons and 2 staff members in 30 square metres, and that'll probably be under the noise regs. I guess if admin could provide a little bit more background around, I guess, why this was deemed acceptable, and I guess in what situations we would in fact enforce requiring a full model to be developed, because I guess in my view, this item, one of the main pieces for consideration to me is amenity impacts and noise impacts, probably most significantly.
Through you, Mayor Zeman, that's correct. So no modelling has been undertaken in this acoustic ladder. Ultimately, the city's sound attenuation policy does require the full acoustic report, and that details exactly what needs to be included within the acoustic report. It includes modelling and consideration of noise receivers around the proposal. And that is required for this development on the basis of non-residential use, being introduced into the residential area. And there's congregation of people and some amplified music. So based on the applicant's approach, they sought to submit this acoustic letter as one measure to avoid providing the full, not completely avoid, but to avoid providing the full acoustic report at the DA stage due to the costs that comes with that and potential uncertainty as well. So the acoustic letter has been prepared to provide the city with some assurance from a acoustic consultant that based on their desktop review and in considering the built form, the location of the parking and the overall operation of the use, that it is of their professional opinion that it is likely to comply with the noise regulations. When considering that letter, ultimately, and in considering it against our sound attenuation policy and the appropriateness of the use in this location, our position is that a full acoustic report is still required to provide that assurity, and that is why we've resulted in conditioning for a full acoustic report to be provided. However, our technical review of the acoustic letter does provide that assurance that it is likely to comply, and if it doesn't, there would be suitable measures to be able to be implemented to mitigate noise impacts and to meet the assigned levels of the noise regulations.
I guess if, just to follow up on that, I guess if we're being asked to delay receipt of that report until after the DA is approved on the basis of deferring or avoiding costs to the applicant, am I able to have an understanding of what those potential costs are?
Through you, Mayor Zeman, we can have a look into that and include it in the briefing notes.
I guess one of my main concerns on noise as well would be this probably overlaps with Councillor Castle's comments, from patrons coming and going. Certainly that's been my experience at, when frequenting North Street store. I think the main impacts are from the crowd noise on the streets. Again, this letter doesn't consider that at all. Would that be a consideration of any future acoustic reports, or are we just looking at people inside the building?
Through Mayor Zeman, we'll confirm that in the briefing notes with some further information from our health team.
I guess, had the applicant had any discussions with you about that waiving of condition 3.2 or 3.3, whichever one it was, around restricting queuing outside the premises? Because I guess I found it curious that their noise assessment doesn't include any referral to people queuing outside or any assessment of people queuing outside the building, and yet they want that condition waived?
Through you, Mayor Zamon, through the application process, we did raise concern with queuing and activity outside the premises, yes.
Thanks.
Okay, are there any further questions? Councillor LaFontaine.
Thank you, Mayor. Just in regard to the waste collection, I mentioned the condition recommended requiring a waste management plan prior to commencement. Now that City doesn't offer the commercial waste collection anymore, does the City have any idea on how often rubbish collection would be or for this commercial waste?
Through you, Mayor Zamon, we do have that information. I know it was infrequent, but we can confirm that with the operator and confirm it in the briefing notes.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions from councillors? I've just got a further question. Concerns have been raised about the state of the verge opposite, and I understand there might be some works that are planned to deal with that. Can I just get an indication of whether any of that was going to incorporate parking, noting that cars park on there now, and it's a dust bowl. So can I get an indication of what's intended to happen on the verge immediately opposite this?
Thank you. Through the chair, we are intending to look at options. One, to reduce the dust mitigation that's happening there as a consequence of the city having to save water on that reserve and not reticulating essentially or watering those areas. That has had a consequence. Some of the intention is to see how we can incorporate both parking and measures to capture water and do some essentially landscaping in that space. So looking at both mitigating the dust, using groundwater and stormwater runoff to essentially water plantings, but also incorporate some form of parking in that space as well. So that's the intention, but it will need a little bit of work to consider how we're going to approach it.
Okay, can I just get an idea of the time frame of when you might have some resolution around whether there's going to be additional parking put in there or not?
My understanding that we're looking at some designs at the moment. This is a response to an annual or a motion that was received through the annual meeting of electors. There was a 12-month time frame on it. I can't guarantee what time the designs might be finalised, but I can include something in the briefing notes.
Thank you very much. Councillor Castle.
Sorry, can I just ask a follow-up on that that point? I'm just wondering about how we, if we are considering a development application that includes the amenity of existing parking available at Menzies Park as part of the consideration, but there is a plan to potentially reduce some of that parking if there's plantings on the verge. How do the two interact?
Through Mayor Cole, essentially when, sorry, correction, Mayor Zamon. I've lost my train of thought. Essentially, we're not considering parking flowing onto that verge area, and that's because under our non-residential parking policy, the proposal does meet the minimum parking standards under the policy. So all parking would be contained on site.
So it doesn't rely on that parking being available?
Through Mayor Zamon, that is correct.
Thank you. Okay.
Are there any other questions in relation to this item? Okay, in that case, we will move on to 5.5, variation of lease to WA Tennis Association at the Robertson Park Tennis Centre. Councillor Alexander, you had some questions?
Thanks, Mayor. Can you just explain to us, why this is a good deal? I'm trying to work out which parts are not being developed and which have been mowed to the standard of the normal park, and the cost currently of $17,000 to the city and the rent is 11,000, nearly 12,000 to Tennis West, and we're looking at waiving that. Could you just explain to me in layman's terms why it's a good deal for the city, please?
Through the Mayor. So as you're probably aware that the city is undertaking substantial works at Robertson Park. At the moment, the condition of the tennis centre is in a significant state of disrepair. We've been waiting to get funding through the CSRFF funding program that will now allow us to deliver on that program. And as a result of the current state, so basically what has occurred is there has been minimal investment in the centre over the last few years because the city's been working on the development plan to get a coordinated development outcome from there and seeking funding to support that. The tennis centre has come to the city and said, due to the state of the courts, we're seeking a fee waiver until the end of stages 1A and 1B. So 1A is the current works that have commenced on site, which is the development of the 4 multi-sport courts. Stage 1B will be the replacement of 12 existing courts with hard courts, and that will occur from the new financial year. So as part of that, at the moment, they are maintaining a grass area that was former grass courts that are no longer in a state to be used. And they have initially requested that the city take over that work. That was going to come at a cost to the city of about $17,000 per annum to do that mowing, to incorporate it as part of our existing program. And so in exchange, we have suggested that we would waive their current rent if they continue to maintain that, and we'll revisit their lease once the stage 1A and 1B works are complete.
Okay, so what that means is that 17,000, they will basically suck that up by the work they do.
That's correct. And I imagine that they can probably deliver that work at a slightly less cost than the city because of the way that our maintenance program works. We wouldn't just go in and do that specific reserve. It would be part of a larger piece of work, but that is correct.
Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Councillor Warner.
Sorry if this sounds dumb. Isn't that already part of their lease, though, that we say that they're not required to rectify any damage that was present prior to the lease, but surely upkeep of what it was should be part of their conditions of lease anyway?
As a simple answer, yes, but more holistically, that is an asset of the city and it forms part of a broader program. I can provide some further information in the briefing notes.
Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Okay, we'll move on to the next item, which is 8.1, Governance Framework Review 2024. Are there any questions pertaining to this? Councillor Wolf.
Thank you, Mayor. In this item, it's been recommended that we adopt the governance framework at attachment 1, but it seems to me attachment 1 isn't quite finished. In reviewing the document, I wrote down there were a couple of sections, I think, sorry, I'm just trying to find the page numbers, page 20, page 12 and page 32. There was a comment around inserting the city's vision quote and the city's values image, replacing the graphics, and could some text be a table or an image? So I was just wondering if we could get some clarification, please, around whether there's been a version control issue or we can expect an updated document in the briefing.
Through the chair. So what probably will need to happen is we can amend the recommendation. So typically with corporate documents, the city will put up a track change version of the document. After council has adopted that, then we'll put it to our marketing team and get them to put it into the clean version of the document. So what I can do is insert in the recommendation that council adopts the track changes version and authorises the CEO to finalise the document into its final form.
I guess some certainty around the changes that would be made post-approval in terms of limiting that to minimal changes, graphics, something like that. I'm sure it's understandable the issue of not having a final document in front of us when we're being asked to approve it. So if we could couch it in those terms that do limit the scope of changes after approval, I think that would be helpful.
Through the chair, that's fine. We've got some standard wording that we use for most of our corporate documents. We can include that in there.
Okay, are there any further questions in relation to this item? Okay, the next item is 5.4, which is Breaker Bar on the portion of Parry Street Road Reserve, 177 Stirling Street, Perth. I had a question in relation to this. I just want to be clear on it. There's no suggestion at all that the actual structure and the way it's constructed, the way it works now is going to change. As I understand it, it's simply a matter of changing the licence by which it occurs. Can I just confirm that my understanding of that is correct?
Through the chair, that's correct. So they have a development approval for the structure, but they had a time limited licence. And since the change to our vibrant public spaces policy, they're required to obtain a licence for this structure because it doesn't meet the design outcomes of a proposal that could be approved under delegation.
Okay, good. I just wanted to get confirmation because it's one of the prettiest parts of that area. Okay. Are there any further questions in relation to this item? Okay, so now we move on to the confidential items. Are there any questions on any of the confidential attachments or any of those items? Okay, in that case, I want to thank the public who turned up tonight and to the 200 or so live stream viewers who are undoubtedly watching at the moment. And I want to close the meeting at 7:27.